Look, the second thing I was asked to talk about was the impact of Toondah on the Minjarrabah Island economy. The changes. Excuse me. I want to do this quickly and fairly starkly. What I want to start out with is just to say the decision a week last Wednesday, in the early part of Thursday morning, by the state government to stop sand mining by 2019 is momentous. It's absolutely momentous. I don't say that because I support the ALP. It's momentous for a state government to stand up to a mining company, and it's even more momentous for it to stand up to a mining company on the basis of Indigenous rights, because that's essentially what it was about. Now, having said that, it does mean there are issues of transition. Issues of transition are much less than they were in 1821, when it came at the point of a gun, and in 1946, when the asylum closed down, and the then, having given one sort of accolade to the Labour Party, let me give them a kick in the pants, when the then minister went over there and the Aboriginal people who were working in the asylum said, what are we going to do now? He said, go back to the bush in 1946. Now, the issues are a bit less than that, but the scale is there. There's somewhere in the order 60 to 70 jobs, much less than Mark Robinson and his cohorts were claiming, but there's still a job situation, job problem. There's also some Redland City jobs. There's a gap in the contribution to the economy that you can probably measure in the order of $8, $10, $12 million per year. So there's a need for transition, and that transition is likely to come from two sources. One is the expansion of tourism, and the other one is the expansion of property development. I mean, they are the two obvious things that are likely to occur, and they will be in competition. Let's be clear. I want to talk quickly, first of all, about the tourism one. The current tourism on the island is run by small businesses, except for Kayak, Kondamuka, who are the biggest provider in the campsites and so forth. They are the biggest single provider. But it is essentially small business, and it is a confused industry. It is part tourism, but it's also part property speculation. People buying holiday homes, middle-class people buying holiday homes, funding them through negative gearing. And those two are in conflict. Those two can well be in conflict. But it's the ideas being put forward by Kayak for tourism are that it becomes the most sustainable tourism location in the country, if not in the world, based on ecological ecotourism, cultural tourism, and so forth. The main emphasis of expanding tourism needs to be on increasing the value added. At the moment, people going on holidays to the island spend very little. You've only got to go down to Toondah Harbour and see their utes loaded up with food and grog and everything else. There's very little to spend money on the island. So the best way of improving tourism there is to increase the take per tourist rather than more tourists. And it's a straightforward model. And that involves coming to the quick. One of the best ways of doing that, and I have to declare I'm involved in some of this, the best way of doing that is to improve the day tourism to Dunwich. Right? It's to give people something, a cultural centre, educational tourism, cultural tourism at Dunwich. Now, that is where we become immediately involved in the problems of Toondah Harbour. what is, and it's rhetoric, and I don't use much rhetoric, I don't find it very useful, but it's useful to, here it is important. What is a 40-year development site at Toondah going to do to the Quandamooka people and other operators who are trying to sell, come over to Dunwich for a cultural experience and lunch? I don't know which goes first, but you know, what's it going to, it's not going to do very much. So that's the first point. The second point is that the development of that day tourism needs to involve alternative departure points. There is already discussion about running a boat out of Brisbane. There is also the need to look very seriously in terms of, and I think it's Jeff Carter talks about this very sensibly, development of bay tourism. Now, again, many of you won't know this, but Quandamooka is the name for Moreton Bay. And one of the dreams, and I've heard this talked around the table, is people coming from overseas, coming for an indigenous experience in Australia. They've got Uluru, they've got Kakadu, they've got the Kimberley. There's nothing on the west coast. What about renaming it Quandamooka? And if that's the case, it requires then a series of facilities on the bay, you know, South Moreton Bay Islands to Dunwich, to Amity, perhaps to Cleveland. Now, one of the questions there, and this goes directly to the rationale for Toondah Harbour, is Toondah Harbour the best departure point for Dunwich and Amity? And that's a matter, you know, for others to discuss, but I'm not convinced that it is. It may well be that it's somewhere at the point here, or it may well be that it's Manly or things like that. It is not an easy place to get to by public transport, etc. It's a bit far from the city. So let's look at those things. The other issues about that in terms of the bay, and this is where I think Jeff Edwards' point about the use of investment. If we want to develop the bay as a tourist thing in its own right, the very first thing we want is a few jetties. You can't land anywhere except, I think it's Dunwich, South Moreton Bay, and Russell. There's no jetty at Dunwich, there's no jetty at Peel. Those things are very important, that kind of transport. Second, a couple of other things, and we'll finish up, in terms of the developing that tourism. One of the big problems of tourism in Stradbroke Island, and indeed in the Redlands, is that it's very fragmented. The organisation, there is no solid, coherent industry body. The island's Chamber of Commerce is run by Sibelco and Stradbroke Ferries. It's very useful indeed. There's a split, as I said, in the tourist providers, the accommodation providers, between the small businesses who are legit and the tax harvesters, some of whom are members of a rival organisation of one I'm a member of. The large providers from the mainland want theme parks. I can say this, the first meeting of the Redland Economic Development Committee, when it discussed transition for Stradbroke, a large ferry company, I wouldn't know what that would be, proposed what was needed was a water theme park on the secondary school site at Dunwich. That just happens to have been taken over by the Quandamooka as well. So they want theme parks, resorts, etc. Now, in the economic transition studies in 2010-11, large, serious tourist providers came over for a day and were asked what they thought. And they said, yes, it's a lovely place, but why should we invest here when we've got every council up and down the coast offering us every incentive we want and we don't have to pay barge fares? So there's that issue. So let's come again to then summarise on Toondah. First, will it assist transport to the island in regard to public transport, parking and ferries? Will it in itself, and I think it will, be somewhat of a counter-attraction if it ever gets built, Why would you go to lunch to Dunwich when you can go to lunch at Toondah? The third one, and this is a bit more difficult, but I think it will happen, is will it induce a rash of similar development at Dunwich? We have MLA Robinson talking about a 50 million port development at Dunwich. We have a proposal for a marina hidden as a small sailing school by the Royal Queensland Yacht Club, which in fact is asking for 60 large boat moorings in Deanville Bay, the large boat being 50 metres. And we have a proposal from the council for $2 million to be spent on master planning for Dunwich. Now all of those are big projects. Finally, and this is the last point I want to make, is I have a concern that the Walkers are a big firm, Sea-Link are now a big firm, or taken over Stradbroke Ferries. I think unless there is some local organisation and some sensible organisation, what we're going to see is that Walkers and Sea-Link are going to fill the void. And they are going to be the ones who are going to be looking to be not to be the tourist providers in the bay, on Minjerribah, and later on Peel Island. And I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks very much.